Hello, my name is Max Banfield. Welcome to my talk. Today I'll be discussing the source of some of the plagues of the 19th century in relation to potentially the pandemic of coronavirus of today. It will be based somewhat on the biographies of Robert Louis Stevenson, and we'll cover several sections of that. In the 19th century, some of the plagues started in Rome and Italy, and it was because some of the poorer people lived in mud dwellings that they dug underground. And at night, they would store their food, their meat, their vegetables, etc. in those dwellings where there were rats and mice and lice and other contaminants. And during the day, they would bring it up and sell it. And some of it would be put on horses and carts and transported along the coast of the Mediterranean to France. The media would report that the plague is coming, and the people of France would see in the towns below that there were clouds. So they'd think that the clouds were bringing the plagues, because even though microscopes were around in some places, there's still a lot of ignorance about the nature of these things. And in some cases, they'd say the stars were bringing it, stardust. From in, flu, and za. Za is star. Influenced by the stars. Influenza is the origin of the word. Well, in France, Robert Louis Stevenson stayed in a house where there was a cesspit underneath, and mosquitoes bred there, and they would bite humans and cause malaria. If they went to the coast and then across the English Channel by boat to London, there's another problem. That was the effects of the Industrial Revolution. There were houses with chimneys, factories, and trains with chimneys billowing smoke into the air. And when there was fogs, it was smog, full of dust and grime from the chimneys, and it was very dark even at midday. And so that caused a couple of problems. One is that the people breathe it in and it contaminate their lungs, making them vulnerable to lung disorders, and had a life expectancy of only 28 years of age. Another problem was that the sunlight couldn't get through, and that produced that is useful in contact of the skin and producing vitamin D. Of course, that can prevent rickets, and also it's an important part of the development of the immune system, which added to the problem. There were also people who were carriers of these things. And for example, a woman was a cook for wealthy families. And wherever she went, she didn't know she was sick, and she didn't think she was causing illness, but she would move on to another family and they'd get sick, and then another family and then they'd get sick. And she became known as Typhoid Mary. There were also problems with refuse draining into the reservoirs. People would drink it and that would make them sick. And there are numerous other things there, but there was also cows, and they had bovine tuberculosis. And their tuberculosis would be transferred to humans by their meat and the milk and their blood. Now, the next thing that happened was Louis would sometimes go across the Atlantic by boat to New York, and he'd be in cattle class department sort of thing, the cabins where people were crowded. He would get off the train, he would get off the boat and get onto a train, and he'd travel across to San Francisco. And on the way, there were spittoons lining the cabins of the trains, and they would dry out, the spit would dry out, and the dust would float about in the air, making other people sick. When he got to San Francisco, he was rather sickly, and he got off that train and caught another train, or maybe horse and car, and went down to Monterey. where he stayed in a hotel where there was a dining room where people would gather to eat. And he said to his girlfriend, who was an Indian squaw, "Will you marry me?" And she looked at him and how sick he was and said, "Don't be ridiculous. I'm not going to marry a scarecrow." And her girlfriend said, "Look, marry him, give him a happy life. He'll be dead in 3 months and you can marry someone else." Well, he said, "I'll give you time to think about it." He went up to the mountains of Monterey and he inhaled some goat dust and he contracted Maltese fever and he collapsed and he was hallucinating when he was rescued by 2 goat herders. And they took him to their woodlog cabin and looked after him until he recovered. And then he went back down the mountain. He said to his girlfriend, "Will you marry me?" And she said yes, and they lived happily ever after. Now, there's a lot more to the story than that. I think this will give you a general idea of how plagues started and how they spread in the 19th century. And you can look at it from today's position to see some differences. For instance, a horse and cart has been replaced by cars, trucks and buses. And the trains have been replaced by bigger and faster trains, and ships are bigger, etc. And they've also invented planes, and they can carry hundreds of people thousands of miles very quickly. So the plagues of today can potentially spread faster and further than before. So I hope you find this information useful in thinking about what you need to do to prevent these problems. And thank you for watching. Tell your friends and take those factors into consideration. Now, as another matter, I wrote this book in 2002 about the health of Robert Louis Stevenson, and it contains a lot of information about those times which you might find useful as well. It's available on the internet for downloading. Perhaps you consider purchasing it and having a look at more details. Thank you.